Good morning, everyone. I like you. Good morning. We're going to kick off our panel right now, actually. My name is Jay Knott. I'm the Chief Business Officer of Apt Associates, and I am a board member of SID Washington. And it will be my pleasure to introduce this session and hand it off to our moderator, Larry Cooley. But I just wanted to give you all a gift, which is the title of this panel is, what will the development professional of the future look like? The answer is different. I think we heard this morning that from those of us who've been in this business for some time, that things have changed, and things always change, and things will continue to change. And certainly, what we can tell already is that people are bringing different skills, and we need those different skills because the challenges that we face are evolving themselves. Whether it's the mosquito or technology or conflict or climate or just dealing with human beings, the tools that you need and the knowledge you have to have in order to be successful at doing that changes as we move through the future. So I think you're going to hear a lot about that from this great panel that we have, which will be ably moderated by Larry Cooley, who's someone who, for some of us old aid folks, is someone who we learned about international development from in the first place, and how to go about doing our jobs in USAID. So we all look at Larry as sort of one of our original professors, and it's always great to see Larry there, because you're getting sort of experience, you're getting perspective, you're getting incisive analysis. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand off this panel to Larry Cooley, who will take you through this panel and introduce our illustrious panel members. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and thank you all for coming. I'm glad I was alive to hear that, and I'm sorry my parents weren't. Let me just say a little bit about this session. Our intention is, although we have a little bit of prepared remarks we want to share with you, it's try to keep this as informal as we can. And if you wanted a kind of a metaphor, imagine that we're in a living room and you're listening in. And somewhere about halfway through, we'll invite you into the living room with us to carry on the conversation. But part of the reason for the informality is not just a tonal one. It's that, honestly, we're speculating, and we know you are too, about this. So this is not a place where we think we've got a corner on some discrete set of information and it's your job just to absorb it. This is a kind of a process of getting our heads around what we know is an evolving circumstance. And I'll, just for a second, although this is entirely about the future, I want to go back just for 1 second, which is in reminiscing with myself about this. I remember what the conversations about exactly this topic sounded like a long time ago when I started doing this kind of work. And I used a metaphor. Now it sounds horribly patronizing, but I think it makes a point. But I used a metaphor that doing this kind of work felt a little bit like being a midwife, that you were present watching countries and institutions be born. Most of the time they didn't need you, but every once in a while you were there with a pair of hands that might be helpful. Then I remember a different metaphor that took over for a while. I used to describe what my colleagues and I did as being like grown-up Peace Corps. And that somehow our job was purely idealistically motivated, just trying to make the world a better place, trying to insinuate ourselves into other cultures, other societies, and make the best difference that we could for their benefit and simultaneously for our own. For those of you who are sitting across the hall, you can't miss the fact that we're in a different world now. We're in a different world for all those reasons, all those defense, diplomacy, development reasons, but the list keeps going. The list keeps going. Think about technology and what that does. Now think about the fact that most of the things that I've done most of my career, there are people in the countries we go to that can do that stuff perfectly well. That may have always been the case, but it's certainly true now. Think about the fact that so many of the places we work now are surrounded by conflict, not just poverty, but conflict in a very obvious sort of way. Think about the fact that probably in a lot of ways we're in a retreat from some globalization, and a lot of this America First kind of logic takes on a different kind of salience. Just keep going down these lines. Now think about the roles of philanthropy and how that's starting to evolve over time. What about the private sector? So there is no question in my mind, but that the level of need, the level of engagement over time is going to continue to grow, and the kind of work that all of you do is going to continue to be important. But I will bet my bottom dollar it won't look very much like it looks today. And to say something that I think is potentially provocative on this, I think there may not be a thing called a development profession 10 or 15 years from now, even though there will be a lot of us doing international development or work that we would recognize as international development. So we've got a great panel to explore these issues, and we're going to first lay out a few concepts for you from three distinct but complementary points of view. Then I'm going to poke with a few questions, and then I'll invite you all to do the same. So there's a little bit of a logic to the order here. I'm going to ask Steve Radelet to begin first, and a number of you I know Steve primarily and probably from his time when he was here at USAID as the chief economist. But it's from a somewhat different perspective that I'm going to ask him to opine today, which is that he's now directing the Global Human Development Program at Georgetown, and therefore comes in touch with a wide range of graduate students and ex-graduate students who are entering into or maybe trying to make a lateral change in their careers in development. I want him to give us a sense as to who's coming in and what they're looking for, just to give you a little bit of a foreshadowing of where we're going with these opening remarks. Then I'm going to ask Ambassador Julieta Valls Noyes to speak a little bit from her current perch. In her case, she has a long, very distinguished diplomatic career, most recently including being the ambassador to Croatia. But right now, she's the deputy head of the Foreign Service Institute. So again, I want her to reflect, as I'm sure she's going to, both about this diplomacy development link, but more particularly from the FSI perspective. What kinds of skills are people being equipped with now, and how does she imagine that changing over time? And then finally, to add a more perhaps familiar perspective, I'm going to ask Kate Warren, who's the executive vice president from DevEx, which in some ways defines the parameters of if you said who's in the development business, it'd probably be all the people who read DevEx. So DevEx, besides the many contributions that they make, have recently done a survey in terms of what their readers, means you, think is going on in the development field. I'll ask you to share a little bit of that, and then we'll go to a more interactive format. Steve.
Great. Thank you, Larry. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's great to see everybody this morning. So I want to start, I guess, with two big trends, I think, that are going to be among many that will shape the development professional of the future. One is the major changes going on in developing countries themselves, as you all know, at multiple speeds and multiple differences across developing countries. Much more diversity within what we now call developing countries than certainly was the case 20 or 30 years ago. Countries getting into middle income status and upper middle income status, while at the same time we have countries that are in conflict or post-conflict, countries working with refugees, countries working with those kinds of issues, while at the same time countries that are not working on those set of issues at all, but are working with business and impact investing and technology and a whole new set of issues. And so we've got this major diversity going on with the growth and development of so many countries. And with that, much more talent and capacity and skills within developing countries than there were back when I started, when the latest technology was the invention of the steam engine, I think. But lots more capacity and skills, and that's actually really central to where I want to go. Second thing, of course, is the diversity in sources of financing. and how that's changing so quickly. So quick quiz here. I'm going to ask you what the largest source of development finance is now, right now. First choice, and you're going to raise your hands, but first choice is going to be foreign aid. Second, philanthropists and foundations. Third, foreign direct investment. Fourth, remittances. Fifth, local government finance. Okay, so raise your hand if you think the largest source of financing today is foreign aid. Easy question, everybody knows that's not. One or two hands. Second, foundations and philanthropists. Anybody want to take that? No? Third, private investment, FDI. Lots of hands for private investment. Fourth, remittances. Lots of hands for remittances. And then local government finance. Local government finance is by orders of magnitude the largest. It is larger than all other sources combined. In fact, it is more than twice as large as all other sources combined. The increase in local government revenues over the last 15 years, the increase is $3 trillion. That's just the increase over the last 15 years. That's where the action is and will increasingly be. It's 6 times larger than FDI at the moment. So these changes are happening, not always well recognized. So what that means for development professionals, they're going to have to be able to work in a much more diverse set of countries with new sets of issues, climate change, security and development, energy issues, and be able to change over time. But they're also going to have to be working much more with local leaders, local governments, and local organizations than is the case today. The development professional of the future is going to change their role many times over their careers. They're going to have to be very flexible and have those kinds of adaptive skills. They're going to have more on-the-ground experience because the locus of the action is going to shift towards developing countries themselves rather than in Washington as it should be. They're going to need to meld a big picture understanding of the big trends in development and the history of what's happened in Asia, Africa, Latin America, together with what's going on in the ground on the specific cases they're working on. And so they have to combine the big picture understanding with the specific skills. And that's going to mean they're going to have to be able to integrate across sectors and across countries and be much more adept at seeing big trends and patterns and what the implications are for what they're doing on the ground. So those are some of the big things that I think they're going to need. In terms of specific skills, quant, data-driven, M&E for sure in almost anything that people do, big-time analytic skills. For many, a bigger focus on finance skills, business skills, especially if you're interested in social entrepreneurship and impact investing. You got to know how to read a balance sheet, and you got to know how private sector finance works. Communication skills, writing as always, but verbal, oral presentation, data visualization, those kinds of communication skills are becoming more and more important. It's not only what you know, but how you communicate what you know. Understanding these multiple sources of finance. You can't just be good at USAID contracting anymore. You're going to have to understand how to work with a whole multiple set of financiers going forward. And people skills, especially as you're working more and more with local leaders and local governments. The development professionals of the future are going to work for different kinds of organizations. They'll work less for the U.S. government or implementing agencies, at least as they are now designed, and more directly for local governments and local institutions in developing countries. And implementing organizations, I think, are going to have to be working more with local governments and local institutions. Development professionals will be working more with businesses, both large multinationals, but also impact investors and social entrepreneurs, as well as foundations and philanthropists. So it's a changing environment. There's a lot there. We try to do this at Georgetown in the master's program that I run, where we bring together work on big picture issues together with very specific skills and allow students to get that big story, but also to concentrate in specific skills. And we bring together people that are working with refugees and in emergency situations with those that are doing impact investing and have those skills. And we're trying to change every year. And I brought a gift, actually, for those of you that are looking for the development professionals of the future. There's about 5 of them right over there that are freshly minted with their certificate. So I brought you a gift. Go and hire them, and you'll be much better off if you hire my students that are over there. Raise your hand over there, my good students. They're very shy, which I don't remember them being very shy. Anyway, thank you.
Steve, before I go to Julieta, let me just ask you a couple of questions if I could. What's the national composition of your students in your program?
Changing rapidly. We're at about 40% international students, and we're trying to raise that, and the biggest constraint is financing, for students. But we have large numbers in terms of certainly applications and those we accept. We're at half, 2/3 from developing countries, up from about a quarter several years ago when we started. And I suspect that we're going to be around 2/3 or so from developing countries. And by developing countries, they're coming from all over. We have many students from South Asia, from East Asia, Latin America, increasingly from Sub-Saharan Africa.
And can you tell, is it the aspiration of those people to return to their own countries or to become international actors?
The aspirations are to either go back and work for their own country or to work in international organizations where they can work across countries. But they believe, it's interesting because I just actually spoke with one who's coming in next year. She's from South Africa. She came in yesterday. And she said many people had wondered why she didn't just go to school in South Africa. And she said, because in South Africa, I will meet people from the Southern African region. Only in Washington will I meet people from Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. And so it's still the place where they want to come to meet people from all over the world, learn those skills, learn those experiences from others, and then go back to their home country and apply those lessons.
By a show of hands, how many of you in the room were born in a country other than the United States? That's what I thought. It's about half, maybe more than half.
More than half.
Okay, Julieta, maybe if you wouldn't mind, let's pick up the storyline.
Okay.
Exactly there. And
Great.
what does it look like from the perch of the Foreign Service Institute?
So I'm really glad, Larry, that I don't have to tell you what the future development professional, or who the future development professional will be. And maybe you're wondering why you have a State Department diplomat speaking on this panel, but I think for those of you who listened to the earlier panel about the intersection between diplomacy, development, and defense, the lines are getting really blurry. So it's absolutely a truism that we're all working on these issues, and maybe that's why you all invited me. But what I would like to talk about today is not who this person is, but what knowledge, skills, and qualities, attitudes the future development professional will have. And I'm going to echo a lot of what Steve just said. I'm glad that we don't have a difference of opinion on these things. But let me tell you a little bit about how we right now at the Foreign Service Institute are training State Department, USAID, Defense Department, and other national security agencies, the personnel of all of these agencies, to do the work of diplomacy and development into the future. And what kinds of skills, what kinds of training we're providing in order to help them excel in their jobs. Now, as you might expect, some of the most crucial knowledge that people will need to carry out these jobs in the future are foreign language skills, geographic area studies knowledge, cross-cultural communication. I can tell you right now at the Foreign Service Institute, we are currently training people how to speak 70 different languages. Wow. We do testing in over 100 different languages to see people's skill levels. And we provide geographic cross-cultural awareness course of study that progresses over an entire career at increasing depth and increasing complexity. Another area of knowledge that we think future development professionals will need is greater knowledge keeping up to date with changing technological trends and opportunities. We have to constantly modernize the knowledge base because if you're out there working in a particular area, say global health, you're not necessarily keeping up in advances in artificial intelligence, but you need to in order to continue to work in global health. So we are providing training in these areas. We've got some new courses on, for example, data analysis and visualization, or blockchain for international development that are very popular and very helpful to our employees. In terms of the skills, the skill set that diplomats and national security experts and development experts will need going into the future, the world is evolving, as Larry was saying, and there's trends, technology, demographics are changing very, very rapidly. So people that are going into the field or maybe staying here to work on these issues have to have intellectual agility and expertise. They build that through their personal expertise, but they can also be trained in some of these skill sets. And our instruction helps keep them up to date in areas like energy, cybersecurity, capital markets, global health policy, biotech, international challenges. And as Steve mentioned, there's definitely cross-cutting skills that people who are going to excel in this field need to have. You have to be able to write well. If you're writing a grant proposal or a presentation, you have to be able to communicate well in writing. You also have to be able to communicate well orally. You have to be able to negotiate well and to be a consensus builder. These are skills that you acquire through experience, but also through training, and they're areas that we think that the diplomats, development professionals, soldiers, you name it, if they're working in this area, they're going to have these skill sets and these knowledge base. Getting a little more specific now, with a world that's growingly complex, where there's more conflict, there's also a need for greater expertise in stability operations and the ability for people working in these areas to work across agency lines, to work across sector lines, not just to work within the US government across agency lines, but also to work with private and philanthropic organizations, with academic institutions, with local governments, with all of the people that Steve mentioned in his question at the beginning of his presentation. More broadly, there's also an everyday increasing requirement for people at state, aid, and other foreign affairs agencies to know how to do strategic planning, program management, and monitoring and evaluation skills. And finally, having talked about the knowledge and the skills, I want to talk just a little bit about the personal qualities, the attitudes that people need in order to succeed in this specialization going into the future. And the first one in our growing, increasingly difficult world is personal resilience. People have to be able to bounce back from crises, to be able to deal with stress, to be able to be and live in non-permissive environments, to be able to support their families as you're dealing with these kinds of things, whether you're together or separated. We started work at the State Department in these areas after the bombings of our embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. And over the last 20 years, we've been doing increasing research and increasing training and facilitation of skills in our employees in this critical skill of resilience. And then, of course, leadership. You can't be a leader in international development if you can't lead people, if you can't persuade people to do what you need them to do, sometimes in very difficult and even dangerous circumstances. So leadership skills are really, really critical, and we have a lot of different ways where we are trying to support and help our employees in developing these skills. So I've talked about a whole bunch of knowledge, skills, qualities that this amorphous development professional of the future will require. But if I had to sum them all up in one, if I had to just sort of say, what's the one set of qualities that the future development professional would need, I would say it would be entrepreneurship. It's the ability to see opportunities and to seize them, and to find ways of getting things done even when the path isn't clear. And so with that, Larry, I'll turn it back over to you because I really want to hear what Kate has to say.
Well, I can tell you that your summing remark you would never have heard that a decade or two ago. If somebody in your position had been making the same set of remarks, it would never have ended that way. I mean, that's a remarkable turn of events. Let me just ask you one question before I go on to Kate, which is that if you walk into FSI today, you walked into a classroom or you walked into the lunchroom, it would or it wouldn't be obvious who the development aid type people are and who the diplomacy State Department people are.
You can tell the military officers because they tend to have shorter haircuts. But other than that, it's pretty uniform. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say uniform. Sorry, guys.
So Kate, let's build off of both of these now a little bit. What I'm almost sure is the case is however much change those of you who are in the middle of this profession think is taking place is less than the amount that's actually taking place. Because the thing that, if I've learned anything from just hanging around for a while, is that when you're in the middle of something, it's really hard to see the magnitude of it. And if you underestimate it by thinking it's too small, not thinking it's too big. And so I'm pretty sure big things are going on now, and I'm wondering to what extent your readers who responded to the survey felt that was the case, and to the extent they did, what did they think was going on?
Yeah, well, I think your original statement around the definition of who is a development professional and who's reading DevX, and we're seeing that a lot. It's really changing the kind of typical reader that we have. I might be a tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. It could be an impact investor. So we're really seeing a pretty dramatic shift in how we even define our work and even define what we do and what we cover editorially. From my perch, I oversee our career and recruiting services and content. So we work with professionals that are looking to advance in their careers and employers looking to hire. So we see a lot of trends kind of more anecdotally through our interaction with job seekers, employers. But more recently, we did do a survey, again, feeling like there's this major shift happening and wanting to get a pulse on that with our community around what is the next generation development professional. What does this look like in 10 years? What are the skills, technologies, approaches that people will need to have? We actually originally did this survey 3 years ago with PSI and USAID. And found the findings really interesting and wanted to do it again and see where we are 3 years later. So we just completed a new one with DAI and USAID again. We will be releasing the findings later in June, but we have a lot of the results back. So I was hoping to give you some insight into really what you, our community, is predicting for the shifts in the sector. And I think it very much echoes what the other panelists have said today. But really, 86% of the people we surveyed predict that there will be a dramatic shift in the skills, technology approaches that people will need to know to be able to work and thrive in this sector. And really 4 major factors contributing to that. Again, I think this will echo what others have said. 1, the shifting finance landscape. So in the future, a program manager or business development resource mobilizer might be just as likely to be getting funding from USAID as they are doing a crowdfunding campaign or bringing in investment funds or partnering with private sector corporations. Another stat that we had was something about over 80% of the professionals believe it will be more important to be able to work with a variety of funders rather than just really knowing one funder deeply. And I think today that might not necessarily be the case for a lot of people. You might be USAID, and that's about 90% of your funding, that's about 90% of what you're working on. But really what we're seeing is that having a diversity and flexibility to work across funders is going to be critical. Political and geopolitical climate is changing. There's many factors that are leading to shifts in the kinds of professionals and kinds of work that we will be doing. Obviously, we talked about increasing conflict. I think the definition of what is a developing country is really changing too, and there are developing communities in maybe developed countries and vice versa. It's actually something we struggle with editorially and how we even describe and call these countries, and feeling that it can be very patriarchal in how we make these determinations and definitions. So really what it means to be a development professional. Maybe you're actually doing work in the US one month and another country next month and vice versa. A lot of military cooperation, collaboration with defense and diplomacy. So that is really changing the different kinds of actors that are involved and really how we define it. The human capital transformation, we've talked a lot about the local capacity development in the countries where we work. And I think it goes beyond even just on your USAID project, you now will be hiring almost all local nationals, not bringing in expats. It's actually, social entrepreneurs that are developing their own companies, their own approaches, their own technologies. And they don't see themselves as development professionals. They're entrepreneurs doing work in their own country, but they actually are working on development initiatives. And we might find that we're partnering with them more, trying to leverage the work that they're doing more in more traditional development type of projects. And then, of course, technology. Obviously, that is rapidly shifting the way everyone does their work. We could be delivering aid through drones. Most healthcare workers will probably have mobile technology in their pocket, artificial intelligence and machine learning, providing real-time data to allow us to drive better decision making. This is really changing the kinds of skills and technologies that all of us will need to know or learn in order to be able to do our work. We did talk about what are the most important technologies to know, and so just a few of them that, again, you all said was GIS, more technology integration, big data, digital connectivity, digital finance, cloud computing, AI. 91% said that they plan on needing to learn new ICT skills in the future. But what I thought is interesting is actually more than half of you all said that you don't think your organizations are investing in that skills development, that training. Fortunate everyone has an FSI to help them build these skills. And so we're really seeing that as a challenge. There's this disconnect between what professionals are saying they need to do their work and what organizations are able to provide them. And I think a lot of that stems to the way that funding is currently structured and incentives. A lot of organizations, when they are only getting short-term projects, it's hard for them to justify investing in longer-term capacity needs, but that's something I think we'll see shifting and needs to shift. Steve and Julieta both talked about the soft skills that are required, and I'd say those aren't necessarily drastically different than what are required today. But really what we see as the ideal professional are those that are collaborators and communicators. So again, written and verbal communication skills, definitely key. We see an increase in need in foreign language skills. This is something I actually found maybe a little surprising. I thought, oh, well, everyone's going to be speaking English. Like if you speak English, you're fine. But actually, no, because so much of the work really is localized, working with local governments, local businesses, being able to speak and work in that local language will increasingly be important. A rise in fluency in even Chinese and Arabic, as we're seeing particularly more Chinese involvement in development work, was predicted as being in demand in the future. We work with a lot of universities and their graduate programs, and we surveyed our recruiters around what are the most in-demand degrees. And over the years, that has been shifting a lot too. Obviously, a degree in national development is still a valuable degree, but we're seeing an increase in demand for MBAs, people in different areas of technology, and engineers, econometrics. So it's really shifting the definition of who is a development professional. If somebody is going to a graduate program, might not even know that this is an industry that exists, but they might actually end up working in it. And you might actually be looking to hire them. So as you're looking at organizations or universities to be attracting talent from, I think you'll be drawing from a wider pool, and we'll see these lines between private sector and development and public sector really blurring and being more porous. We work with a lot of large institutions that are now looking to hire people who come from a private sector background. They're not necessarily looking to hire people with a traditional development background. And vice versa. We now are working with a lot of private sector companies, and they really want to be able to bring in somebody who has that development lens and expertise. So I think we'll see some of these walls coming down and it being a little bit more porous between people moving between all these various sectors as we all continuing need to work together. Let's see, I think I'll probably leave it there.
Okay, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to the room. By a show of hands, how many of you think the world that's being portrayed is a little on the scary side? Tell the truth. How many of you are more driven by this sounds exciting and boy, am I lucky to be part of this? That's great. Okay, so let me ask you another question. Of those of you in the room, how many of you spend, let's say, 20% or more of your time working on domestic programs in the US? Okay, I think I see 3 hands. I would bet you if I asked this question in 5 years, at least half the room will raise their hands, I bet you. That's one of the lines that I'm almost sure is going to blur between domestic and international. There's just, if you look at the things that, both wearing the SID hat that I wear now, and also I'm doing a lot of work on scaling of social outcomes, it's completely symmetrical across the development to domestic scheme. The people haven't yet become the same people, but the problems are exactly the same problems. So to me, it's inevitable and desirable that particular line starts to blur over time in exactly the way that Kate was implying from her readership. Let me just ask you a question, Kate. How many people read DevX now?
Well, we have 1 million people as part of our audience.
Isn't that amazing? And how many of those people reside in the United States?
It's probably about 30 to 40%, but the rest being quite global.
You see what I mean? You can just feel the shifting, right? Even as we're sitting here, this whole landscape is shifting, and I think in a really not entirely predictable but very exciting kind of way. Let's take some questions and comments from people in the audience. If it's a question and you want to direct it to someone, by all means direct it to someone. If it's a comment, you don't need to pretend it's a question. I want to speak to a microphone, though. Yeah. Introduce yourself, if you would.
Okay. Mutale Chilangwa of AECOM. I'm a senior business development manager for economic growth and governance department. Ambassador Noyes, you talked about all the different characteristics and the different training that you provide in the foreign service, professionals. What are you doing in terms of diversifying the people that you do hire, the people that you will be sending out? Because I think that part is missing. Skill set is great, training is great, type of quality of people you're hiring is great, but I think what's important is also who is delivering that message, who is designing these type of projects. As the panel pointed out, there's a bigger shift to developing countries in terms of the people that we work with, the counterparts. There's more power shift out there. To give you a little background, I'm originally from Zambia, and when I studied political science in the early 1990s, I was usually the only minority person in those classes. And then I've worked for different international development organizations, and there's been that good shift in terms of having more diversified professionals in my field. But I think what's really important is also having more diversified government officials, either a USAID, a State Department, et cetera.
Right, so that's right on the cusp between a comment and a question, but answer the question part if you would.
So you may have noticed that my name is Julieta. I am, in fact, Hispanic. It is absolutely true that the government has not been as diverse over time as we would like it to be. But I certainly, in the 30 years that I've worked for Uncle Sam, have seen some major changes. And I will say that we are making real progress in terms of diversifying. Speaking for the State Department, I can't speak with as much authority for AID or other agencies, but we absolutely are recruiting and retaining far more women, people of color, people, differently abled people of different sexual orientations. And I can tell you, for example, yesterday I know, and I just found out, not because it was publicized, but because I have a friend who was there, that Secretary Pompeo had a meeting with people from different affinity groups representing different minority groups at the State Department, and didn't publicize it, but he really wanted to talk to them and hear from them what we can do to both bring in more people with more diverse backgrounds and hear from them. What I would add to that is it's not just a matter of recruitment. You can recruit as diverse a workforce as is possible, but if you don't then train them and prepare them to succeed, if some group of people are coming in with perhaps an Ivy League education and someone is coming in from a 2-year program at an agricultural college, they won't necessarily have the same skill sets. And so you have to provide training, you have to provide mentorship, you have to provide experiences, coaching to kind of level the skills so that everyone can proceed. And so I would say that recruitment is one part of the formula, but retention is another very big part of the formula. And we're working on both. We still have a ways to go, but I certainly have seen a major change in the time that I've worked for the government, and I'm excited to be part of making it a bigger change.
How diverse, I don't need a statistic, but just kind of visually, how diverse does FSI feel?
Very diverse. You walk around campus, you hear, and it's a 72-acre campus, it's a beautiful campus, but you hear lots of languages. A lot of our instructors are in fact not Americans. We have instructors, because you want to teach people how to speak languages fluently. The best way to do that is by having people who speak it as their native language as the instructors. But it's very diverse, both in terms of the instructors and the student body, but also in terms of the skill set, the kinds of experiences that they have, and where they're going.
Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Louisa Grieva with Christian Solidarity Worldwide. I was so glad China came up, mentioning that China is becoming increasingly involved in development work, and want to ask about that. Development work, let's say private sector investment, is there something fundamentally different about the internationally investing Chinese companies, which are essentially part of a Communist Party-directed state-mandated industrial policy? Do people need to prepare differently for that kind of work?
Well, I'm going to, before I go to the panel, I'm going to abuse the moderator's role on this, because it just, by total coincidence, I spent yesterday with a vice minister from China and a Chinese delegation talking about exactly this issue. It happened to be a session that was convened by the National Academy of Public Administration to look at how they each look at the role of the public sector and the role of the public sector as not exclusively in international development setting, but we talked on the margins about that. They clearly have a different view of the way development, or what we would call development, fits into their foreign policy, but they're very thoughtful about it. I mean, it's not casual. It's something they've really considered, and they're not apologetic about it. They can put a very strong rationale and a kind of compelling case for why they do what they do. We had what I would call a healthy debate about the pros and cons of different ways of doing this, but it would be a mistake to write that off as somehow just self-serving or narrow. It's not. I mean, they have a whole message, and it's got values as well as interests that are associated with it, and it's a competition in the world place of ideas. Others want to speak to that, to China?
I'll just add, because I think, Larry, you're absolutely right. Of course, it depends a lot across countries. There are some countries where China is not a player at all. Others where they are. Even in Africa, people say it's all across the continent. It's not. It's concentrated in a relatively small number of countries. And they're doing a lot of great things. They're building a lot of infrastructure. They're building a lot of power plants. They're doing a lot of things that are very, very helpful for development. And I think there are also challenges in terms of, because there are differences in terms of motivations. But that, I think, can be very healthy. And I think the challenge for all of us who work in this space is to try to talk with people, bring them into the tent, bring them into donor meetings, bring them into meetings with governments, and hear these perspectives. And what I have found is that in most cases, they're quite open to working with others and trying to find complementary ways to work. Not always, of course, but that it's not always easy for USAID to work with the World Bank or with DFID or anybody else for that matter. But are open, and I think there's some great opportunities that can be taken advantage of for the betterment of the countries we call developing countries right now.
You have a lot of Chinese graduate students?
We do not, actually. A lot go to the business schools or to public policy schools or more technical-oriented schools. So we actually, we do not. We have students from all around the world, but actually not many from China.
Thanks. Pushmi?
Hi, this is Pushmeet. I work with Tetra Tech. So I heard this, I did see you guys talk about soft skills a lot, but soft skills can also be taught, and all the discussions about the courses that you've been talking about have been more technical courses, technology, financial management. They're all talking about actually doing the work, but how to exist in a foreign country. A person might be really good at what they do in M&E, but they might not be able to function with a foreign government or how to deal with a foreign government. So what kind of stuff like a distinction between civil law systems and common law systems, things like those, what kind of education can we impart for those softer skills to give to our the future development professionals to be able to function and not just leave them at soft skills?
I'll ask Julieta and then Steve also to respond to that.
Well, I was only given a few minutes to speak at the beginning, so I didn't cover the universe of everything that we train. We do provide training in those areas as well. And certainly when people arrive at an embassy or at an aid mission, they get a lot of mentorship and advice. We have local employees who are there to support people as they learn and make the transitions. And so you have experiential learning as well. But we absolutely do train for those skills as well. It's not just sort of negotiations in foreign language. We do teach other things.
Could you tell me a little bit more about what kind of classes would you? Because
Well,
I heard when you're talking about...
We have area studies, geographic area studies, cross-cultural communication that starts out very basically at sort of what's the legal system in a country. And then over time, and as a career progresses, you get into increasing detail about, history, of course, is crucial, but also the economy, the structure of the economy, corruption, how much corruption there is, all the panoply of issues that can affect your ability as a diplomat or a development professional to get the work done in the country.
Steve, you want to add?
You won't find it in the way that the names of classes. In our program, we infuse it completely across what we do. It is absolutely central to what we do, even though you won't notice it in a course called Development Finance or Political Economy of Development. And we do that first by who we pick. We only pick students who have experience working in developing countries, and that's important because then they teach each other and begin those soft skills. And we do a lot. The more I pick smart students, the less I have to do. I can go to the beach and they can teach each other. But they learn a lot from each other, first of all, in terms of cross-cultural, but also in terms of the skills and whether they've worked in refugee camps or in businesses. We take them away for a weekend retreat as soon as they arrive so that they get to know each other really well. Within courses, lots of group work, lots of presentation skills, and therefore lots of work for listening to others and learning from them and respecting what others can bring and how you can work in a group together. During the summer between their first and second years, they go to a developing country to work, which we actually pay for, but they're all leaving this week to go work around the world. And then in their second year, they work in pairs for a client organization on what we call a capstone project on using those. And so all of those soft skills are absolutely infused throughout the curriculum, although you won't see it in terms of the name of a class, because it's not the kind of thing where you can stand up and teach these in a class. You got to do them. And so from day one, we infuse it in how we do the curriculum, not the specifics of the technical skills.
Thanks very much.
Hi there. My name is Douglas Kerr, and I'm with NCBA CLUSA, the National Cooperative Business Association. And my question is really for Steve, but happy for anybody else to react to it as well. I was thinking about future scenarios, and Steve, I was thinking about your book, The Great Surge. And if there's anybody in the room who hasn't read it, you can buy me lunch afterwards. Anybody who hasn't read the book, you really should. It's a fantastic book. To what extent is Administrator Mark Green's vision for the future in terms of eliminating the need for development correct? To what extent is he on point? Or alternatively, is it the case that there's always going to be problems? I mean, right now there are 4 immense famines in Africa. Food insecurity problems to be addressed by 2050 is unimaginably difficult. Global warming is creating a range of issues that we can only imagine, including having a role in starting the war in Syria. So, is it a rosy future or a scary future?
Well, it's generally a rosy picture unless you live in South Sudan or Yemen or some of the places that are left behind. But to your point about Mark and on the future, the problem, there are fewer and fewer developing countries that are going to need traditional development assistance, no question about it. That doesn't mean that the U.S. should disengage with those countries at all. Obviously, diplomatically, security-wise, lots of ways we can engage, but also in terms of technical assistance on ways that we might call development skills, even when countries are richer. If we and implementing agencies have the skills that we believe we have, then countries ought to be able to hire us to do that kind of work. So even in those countries that are succeeding, I think there's going to be a different but possible continued role. But there are a set of core countries that are not making much progress and that are caught in conflict, that are caught under dictatorship, and those are, I wish those problems were disappearing. They're smaller than they were 20 or 30 years ago, for sure. There's less conflict, there are fewer countries that are in that situation, but there are a lot of them, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And it is in the selfish interest of the United States to engage with those countries and help them to become more stable and more capable. So that role is not going away. And then you mentioned climate change and others. That's the classic public good of all public goods, which is not going away. And even countries that are relatively more successful now are going to need, I think, some help and assistance in thinking about alternative sources of energy and how to adapt to climate change. So the role is changing. I think there will be a smaller set of countries where we might have traditional engagement around aid, but it's not going to disappear, in the next couple of decades.
Thanks.
If I could jump in on top of that one. So I was most recently chief of mission in Croatia, which back in the early 1990s, after the Balkans War was a mess. It was devastated, was a net producer of refugees, had all kinds of mines all over the country, major unemployment, very huge problems. They worked very hard. We had a big aid mission in Croatia, and then they worked with the European Union. Eventually, fast forward, joined the European Union. At that point, joining the European Union is a very clear cutoff point for receiving U.S. foreign assistance. However, Croatia became, with the whole migrant route, a net receiver of refugees from North Africa and the Middle East. And Croatia became a route, along with other countries in the area, for potential movement of terrorists. And they continue to have a mining issue. And so what we found is we couldn't provide traditional foreign assistance. However, by being creative in how we deployed our counterterrorism funding, we were able to provide law enforcement training, to develop them into being a regional leader as one of the 2 countries in the Balkans that was in the European Union. They kind of became a regional leader with support from us, but from the European Union. And so it's not that they weren't getting assistance from us. In some ways they still were, but they were also providing assistance to us. And it was more of a partnership of equals, and they were becoming a regional leader. And all of this happened in 25 years, but they transformed themselves through their own actions, through our assistance, through the assistance of the European Union. And yet at the end, they then became a leader, but we're still receiving some forms of assistance in different flavor.
I'm going to, just because I'm watching my watch a little bit, I'm going to take these 3 all together and respond, and then I'll take these 3. Go ahead.
Good morning. Eileen Barber from DAI. I wanted to ask, I've been hearing a common theme this morning, and it's about collaboration and coordination, whether it's between government, the private sector, philanthropic organizations, or working across agency lines, as the ambassador mentioned. What's the best way for many of us in the room here who don't work directly with one of those agencies, the Department of Defense, or we're not in the private sector, how can we actually do that on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, don't answer yet.
Good morning, Graham Couturier from Equal Access. I particularly appreciated the focus on staff retainment, retaining individuals. Obviously, as the profile of future leaders diversifies and their level of mobility increases, their ability to mobile, not just from organization to organization within our sector, but within our field versus other fields. So I'm curious, either from your own career experiences, the students that you speak with every day, or your alumni, what are the things that we can do as a field, and particularly implementers and employers in the field, to retain staff and retain these leaders, not just within our own organization, but within our field versus other sectors? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Judy Cochrane from SIL International, and I heard all the panel members talk about the importance of foreign language and also a movement towards localization. So I'd love to hear your comments about the types of languages that the future development professionals will need to know, and specifically, if you think that that will mean a movement beyond the kind of the key dominant languages and maybe understanding more of the non-dominant languages.
Interesting question. Gates, you want to start and pick whichever of those?
Yeah, well, I can start with the languages just based on the survey we just did, and we also survey recruiters, employers each year on these kinds of questions. I mean, French, without a doubt, is the most in-demand foreign language skill amongst the organizations we work with because of all of the work in Francophone Africa, and frankly, because of a lack of a lot of local capacity, so they often are looking to bring in international experts and need them to be able to speak and operate in French. But Spanish, of course, if you want to work in Latin America. So I think if you look at where a lot of the work is being done and what the dominant languages are there, it echoes the demands for those language skills. Where we are seeing the increase is also in Arabic. I did mention Chinese, and that I think is more speculative at this point, and people seeing the rising influence of China and assuming that speaking Chinese will be helpful. I wouldn't say I've actually seen that playing out in job requirements and the hiring that people are doing today. But yes, I do think that as there are more local actors that are able to run and implement the work themselves, it will be challenging to come in as a maybe English dominant person if you aren't speaking the local language and be able to work with them. But as the world, whether we're becoming less globalized, more globalized, I do think that English will still obviously be a useful language skill. I want to chat a little bit about the mobility of careers and how to retain staff. And another trend that we hadn't gotten into today that is not unique to development, but is this whole kind of gig economy. And I would say that development actually has been in the gig economy for quite a while. And many of you here might be working as independent consultants, as there is the role of international type of professional is a little bit more in a capacity building, advisory type of role. I think we will increasingly see a need for short-term expertise and consultants and people that are able to move between these different actors and organizations. Many of the large institutions, but the World Bank, UN agencies that we work with, over half of the people they employ are technically consultants. It allows them to build a more flexible, agile workforce for the better or worse of what that means for the specific individuals and their long-term career progression and growth. I think we will continue to see that trend. And I think the challenge will be, how do we collectively, as a sector, invest and build in the skills of our professionals when, again, there isn't that long-term incentive of, oh, well, I have this person for a 3-month project. I'm not going to send them to this training that's going to cost me several $1,000s when now they're going to go to another organization next month. So I think that's a real challenge for all of us as a sector to grapple.
Thanks. Steve?
On the languages, we actually require proficiency in a second language as a graduation requirement and then offer free courses in almost any language in the world. Actually, one of our students took advantage of that to learn sign language so that he could work with refugees who have lost their hearing in camps. So So in terms of what languages, Kate already mentioned several. Arabic is a very big one, and lots of our students are wanting to learn Arabic, Swahili, and several others. Part of it is to learn that language, but part of it is to learn how to learn languages. And because, you know, if you learn Swahili, that's great if you're working in certain countries, and doesn't help very much in other countries. You know, the language that I learned, the second language I learned was Samoan, which doesn't really help a whole lot. But I was good at it when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. But it's partly how to learn languages, and having, when you drop into a new country, even having the skill and the willingness to learn a few words and be able to communicate with people. So learning the language opens the doors to learning other languages and being able to communicate with people in good ways. So that's on the language. On retaining staff and mobility, it's partly about the flexibility of the organizations themselves and how much they're willing to change and move with some of these flows. And some implementing agencies are showing to be better at that, and others not so well. And I think there's going to be some real changes going forward in terms of that flexibility, both in terms of the ability of organizations to move towards new kinds of financing sources, but also working with local governments, as I mentioned, but then also being able to retain people. And the less organizations are adapting, the more they're going to have trouble retaining staff. That's one comment. The other is, though, it's not a bad thing for professionals to move from one organization to another. So it's a fine goal in terms of retaining staff, but not taken too far, actually. I think it's a good thing for organizations to hire someone who's worked for somebody else, and for someone who's worked for you to go work for someone else. And yes, there's transitions.
Your framing was in trying to keep people in our field and not exclusively.
In the field, that's right. That's right, in the field. So sometimes it's good to retain people in the field, but it's also good to cross-fertilize a little bit and bring in those skills Larry was mentioning earlier, working with domestic organizations and others. So to some extent, you do want to retain people, but to some extent, you want to, some cross-fertilization is a good idea. But to retain people, it's in I think the nature of the organization itself and how flexible and how adaptive they are, and therefore the opportunities that they are providing for people.
I feel really, excuse me, really badly about doing this, but I'm going to apologize to the three women who are standing here. I know we're not going to make it to those questions. We will linger afterwards if you'd like to ask your question to the panelists. But I do want to give each one a chance to say a couple of concluding remarks.
Did you want Julia to
I do.
Yeah,
I'm going
to
to do that, but I just want to kind of set up, because I'm watching people, the body language, as people start looking toward the door. So Julieta is going to both make her remarks on this, but I will ask you at the same time to say any concluding remarks, and then I'll work back down.
Sure. So I did want to get to the first question that was asked, which is how do you foster collaboration and cooperation, not just across government agencies, but also with outside organizations? And I would say that it's just like in any other businesses, you have to work on relationships, and you have to get to know people, you have to work with them, you have to have relationships with them before the crisis hits, so when the crisis does hit, you are ready to tackle it. You have the friendship, you have the trust, you have the email addresses and phone numbers that allow you to move quickly. I would, just in conclusion, I'd like to say it's been an honor. Thank you for having a non-development professional speak to you, but I think maybe it's a sign of the times that we sort of are all working in this area, and I think it's exciting. I also wanted to just get back to the question about the languages. Which languages are needed? Well, which language do you want to learn? I think there's a lot to be said for following your passion. If there's a country in the world, or if there's something that you care deeply and personally and passionately about, maybe it's not French, maybe it's Dari, but you're able, and you really want to learn Dari and get really knowledgeable and learn the language well and learn the region well and the history well. There's something to be said for specialization, and there's something to be said for passion. So I think let's not forget that at the end of the day, everything that we do has to be not just a profession, but something that fulfills us in our life.
Thanks. Steve?
We've said a lot about the changing development professional of the future, but I just want to, my final comment actually will pick up on what I was just saying in my last response. I think a lot of this is around the changing development organization of the future. And it's not going to be enough for people to think about who do I want to hire and what does that development professional look like. This is closely related to what's my organization going to look like in 10 years, and how do I get there, and how do I make a more flexible and responsive organization that is able to move with the trends towards much more local ownership and local leadership and local financing, and what does that mean for my organization? How do we take advantage of changing technology and use and adapt that? How do we become a much more flexible and adaptive organization? And I think when organizations think about it that way, then it's a natural follow-up of how we can attract those professionals. And those are the places where the new professionals are going to want to work, are the organizations that are more flexible, more adaptive, more working with people that have been excluded for so long, with women and with the poorest of the poor. And that means a much stronger local presence. So I think this is closely related to how development organizations themselves think of themselves and see and adapt to the changes going forward. I suspect some of our current development organizations are going to be quite good at that, and I suspect some are not. And we're going to see some real changes in that landscape of actors in the coming years.
Thanks. Kate?
Yeah, I will somewhat echo that. I think that the organizations and professionals that will be successful are the ones that are embracing this change. And while it can seem scary, it's all, I think, very good and exciting. It's for the betterment of our sector. So those that are able to get on board and approach things in a new way, I think we'll be able to see a lot of success and results. We are at DevX continuing to think about how we can play a role in connecting all these different actors, people, professionals, organizations. So definitely invite you to share your thoughts and ideas with us as we continue to explore this from our editorial side. We are having our DevX World Conference in a couple weeks. We're actually bringing all of these actors together in one room to talk about how we can actually work together and move forward on some of these big challenges in the world. But overall, I'm optimistic and excited about a lot of what we're seeing happening in this space, and so I hope you all are too.
My hope is that everybody will go away from this with at least one new thing they want to learn. But before we do that, what I'd like you to do is join me in thanking the panel for a really interesting conversation. And thanks to all of you for not just for choosing to be here to talk with us about today, but for choosing this as an area to work on. It really matters. Thanks.